The red flashing.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, brilliant stuff. See, flashing orbs. There we go. Well, fantastic. What an amazing parable that is. And so what's going to happen is that we are now going to begin a new series as a church on the parables of Jesus. And it's going to be really, really good. But before we do, we're just going to spend just a couple of minutes looking at what a parable actually is. Because the parables of Jesus make up a crucial part of the three Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. But interestingly enough, there are no parables in the Gospel of John, and there's a reason for that, which I'll deal with another day. And with the parables, it seems that every page that you turn in the Gospels, that there was a parable. It's a bit like going down to the beach and saying, where can I find a pebble? Everywhere you will look, you will either see a pebble or sand. They are just all over the place. Now, what Jesus did was that he simplified great spiritual truths that he needed to share with us, and he put them in the form of relatable stories that are very easy for us to understand. So basically, a parable is a tale about a single common subject to illustrate a deeper, valuable lesson. And he actually made them so easy that even a dimwit like myself can actually understand them, or a child. Because what Jesus did was, many times he was talking to crowds and there were always children there. And I can imagine that even the children could understand what Jesus was talking about. And sometimes Jesus begins a parable with an analogy, such as the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out at dawn to hire labourers for his vineyard, which you can find in Matthew 20. Or Jesus may provide an example from everyday life, such as the parable of the Good Samaritan, to emphasise love and mercy, and also to make a stand against the prejudice that people can feel towards other people. Or there's the parable of the friend at midnight, to show persistence in prayer. I often refer to that as the parable of the nagging granny. Although it's not called that, but that's just my own little term for it. And we're going to discover over the next few weeks the many parables of Jesus from the books of Matthew, Mark and Luke. And it's going to be fun. But as the BBC used to say, that's all subject to change if something else crops up in the meantime. And this week we're going to be looking at a parable that many of us, in fact, most people would have heard of. It's the house built on the rock and the house built on the sand, or the wise and the foolish builders. Now, Jesus tells this parable at the end of some absolutely amazing teaching in what is called the Sermon of the Mount. And just to give you just a quick recap of that, it starts in chapter 5. So you have the Sermon on the Mount, which says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." Jesus talks about salt and light. He talks about the fulfillment of the law. He talks about murder. He talks about adultery, he talks about divorce, he was teaching about that, about oaths and promises. He talked about an eye for an eye. Oh, you probably heard that saying. He talked about love for your enemies. Wow. He talked about giving to the needy. He talked about prayer. And in fact, this is where we first taught the Lord's Prayer. Jesus then taught about fasting. He taught about treasures in heaven. He taught us about do not worry, which is a little passage that I read. You move into chapter 7 and Jesus was talking about not judging other people. He then taught us to ask, seek and knock when it comes to prayer. Jesus then talked about the narrow and the wide gates where it talks about salvation. He then taught the people, and he teaches us about true and false prophets. Then also about true and false disciples, because I don't know if you know this, but there can be true and false followers of Jesus, and there's more and more fake Christians appearing all over the place. Every single week it seems that there's more appearing. And then today we look at the wise and the foolish builders. And it's really amazing, because there was loads that Jesus had been doing all of his teaching over a period of several days. And he finishes everything off. It's like the cherry on the cake when he comes up with this last parable. And he comes straight to the point in verse 24. He says this: "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and put them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rock is the teachings of Jesus. It's not Dwayne Johnson from the movies, The Rock. That's not who he's talking about. It's Jesus. And Jesus is very clear there. He said, look, if you listen to all these teachings, if you listen to all of these things, your entire life, your faith is going to be built upon my teachings, which is rock-like. And what a fantastic encouragement that is that if we listen to what Jesus says, then we are going to be on the right track. And Jesus paints this amazing picture for us of a man who looks around and sees what's going on all around him. He was aware of his surroundings. And I would guess that the man who built his house upon the rock would have been living near a river, or perhaps even in a valley which is subject to flooding. We don't know for sure. But he had the common sense to realise that if it rained, that there could possibly be flooding. Maybe he had chatted to some local people in the area and they told him about the high water levels when it rains. It's always sensible to do that, isn't it? You know, I always get concerned when people, when you get builders, they say, oh, we're going to build on there, and it's a floodplain. Why would you build on a floodplain which gets flooded? It seems silly. And this man, he takes actions. In other words, he puts the advice that has been given to him into practice. He looks around and he sees that if a big storm comes, that he will possibly be flooded. So he builds his house on the rock. Now, we don't know whether it is higher up, like in the little video, or whether it is on the rocks at ground level. It doesn't make a lot of difference, but he built it on the rock. Years ago, when I was a young military policeman in the Royal Military Police, we were on exercise out in Germany, and we'd been out for several weeks, and we were given a very rare night off. And so we parked up our vehicles, and several parked their Land Rovers in this hollow in the ground. There was like a road, and then there was this great big dip, and so they drove inside there, thinking to themselves it's going to make good to put camouflage netting above and all that sort of stuff. It was, you know, it did seem quite nice, and it was out of the wind. There was a local German man walked past and said, "That hollow will flood if it rains from the sky." Well, it's a terrible German accent, I know, and Catherine's grimacing. Anyway, basically he said, that hollow's going to flood if it rains. Don't go in there. And it gets very deep, he said, like that. But nobody listened. Well, there was no room for me and another Land Rover because we were at the back. So what we had to do was that we parked on this little rise by some trees. Nobody listened to him, just remember that. There was no sign of rain. It was a beautiful evening. There was birds twittering and flying, and it was quite nice, and all very nice. And so there were those four Land Rovers, all the equipment, a lot of equipment, a lot of gear. The only problem I experienced that night was the mosquitoes who kept on buzzing around me. Well, later that night, it started to rain, just a little few spots at first, and thought, oh, that's not too bad. But then all of a sudden, the heavens opened. It came down. There was thunder. There was lightning. There was wind. There was trees blowing all over the place. And to be honest with you, I just curled up in the back of this Land Rover and I fell asleep because I love the sound of rain. I just love it. However, about 4 o'clock in the morning, we were woken up by this shouting and yelling, which I just tried to ignore. I put my fingers in the air. But eventually, we went outside and see what was happening. And in this hollow, the water was above the doors of all of the Land Rovers in there. You couldn't see them. All you could see was the top half and 10 military policemen sitting on the roof, soaking wet, yelling for help, miserable, and they were trapped. It was so deep. If you think a Land Rover roof was probably that tall, so that was that deep just as quick as that. What we didn't know, and we found out later on the day, was that there was a small river which ran alongside the other side of the hollow. But also there had been this flood channel had been built, because when it rained, the village nearby used to get floods. And so they built this channel which came through this hollow, so that when it rained, all the water would be diverted from the village. We didn't know that, although this man tried to tell us. Well, the banks burst, and the water flooded trapping all the lads. It was quite a sight. There were some pictures doing the round for some years afterwards of these poor fellas trapped on top. And apparently, the words "I told you so" wasn't the correct answer when they asked for help. And I had a few things thrown at me, but anyway. So, in our parable, the wise man looks around. Now, we all know that water doesn't flood, it doesn't wash rocks away, does it? If you look into a stream or the seashore, you see the waves going over, you see the river going over. So what is the rock in this case, in this parable? Well, it's the words and the teachings of Jesus, because they never change. The words of God never, ever change. People are trying to change it at the moment and saying, oh, it doesn't really mean that now, but actually God's word never changes. And we live in a world at the moment where everything is changing so fast, and it seems that what was right and good last year now seems evil to everybody. But God's words never change, and we need always to remember that. It's impossible for God to change his mind about what he has written in the Bible. He can't do that because God's words are immutable. They cannot change. It's not like me as an author. Now, I've written 3 books and working on my 4th book. I'm always changing stuff, and my spelling is dreadful, and I keep on changing things around. Jane's shaking her head and saying, yeah, that's true, it's really bad. But God isn't like that. Once he's written it, that's it. That's why we need, as individual Christians and as a church, to read and study God's word, so that when the storms of life rain down on us, as they do with alarming frequency, that we won't be washed away, that we won't give up, that we won't fall into despair, or if we do, it's just momentarily. And then we stand up because Jesus is our hope. You see, faith is a very practical thing as well as a spiritual thing. Now, how do we know this? Well, Jesus says here that therefore everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice, and the key word here is put them into practice. We have to do what the words say. There's no good God's word teaching us to love our neighbour, which is a command, as we looked at last week, and then we go around hating people and saying, oh, I can't stand that people group, I can't stand them, because we're not putting God's words into practice, are we? So that's why we must do what he says here. Therefore, the one who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is a wise person. Jesus wants us to have this practical faith, and not just to hope for the best and see which way the wind of public consensus blows this week. And by that I mean that we don't just sit back and wait for something to happen. If we want to grow as Christians, which I'm sure that we all do, then we have to listen, read, and put into practice what Jesus taught. And when you look at Matthew's Gospel 5, 6, and 7, the very, very basics, that was at the start of his ministry. He was teaching people the very basics. Give to the needy, don't be angry, love your neighbour, don't judge, and so on. Those are the basics. But so many Christians, we miss those. We miss the very basics. And it's time that we go back to rediscovering the basics of what a real faith in Jesus means, of how to stand on his word and to put into practice what he teaches. So when trouble comes, as in this case that we're looking at today, there was a mighty storm that had the power to wash everything away, then we will be ready and able to survive what happens. If we want to follow Jesus, and I often bang on about this, if we want to follow Jesus well, then we need to follow his teachings that I read out earlier. We need to follow that. And over the years, I've seen many people turn away from faith because they haven't grasped the basics of what Jesus taught, and therefore were not prepared for when life's problems comes. We have the parable of the sower, which we'll be looking at in a few weeks' time. You know, when their farmer went out and sowed seed in fields, some went in thorns, some went on rocky ground, some was gobbled up by the birds, but there's a fourth lot where people produced a huge crop. That's how we have to be. But listen to the second man in the parable. In verse 26 it says, but everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. Well, the rain came down, the streams rose, the wind blew and beat against that house that fell with a great crash. I mean, can you picture, these great big storms? I mean, we've had some big storms in Dover, haven't we, recently? Really huge ones, and we've been to like the seafront, and you've seen these massive waves coming up and heard the wind going. I just get that picture of that. And the video kind of gave a little bit of a picture. And what a crash it was when that man's house fell. The sad thing is that the foolish man saw exactly what the wise man did. They both built in the same area, the same environment, and both had access to the same information, but one person chose to build his house on the sand. The foolish man didn't take heed of the danger. And I can imagine him thinking to himself, everything will be fine. Let's just cross our fingers and hope for the best. We've managed to build without digging great big deep foundations. We've saved a few pennies. We've got the house up first. We've got sand around us. Oh, it's nice to step out of the house and get sand between your toes rather than cold old rock. Wow. But what a foolish decision that was. And so often people in life, including many Christians, will go for the easy route. They want an easy life, but trouble is though when trouble comes, it's like, what do I do? Instead of turning to the Lord straight away. I've known a few people over the years have gone on holiday without holiday insurance, without a medical insurance. There's a friend that I knew who went all the way to China and he didn't take out medical insurance. He got there, he had an accident and had to be all kinds of help. It cost over £200,000 to treat him and to fly him back. That all had to be paid by families and they were in debt for years. Or I've known people who have gone on long car journeys without RAC cover or AA cover, and they go off on long journeys, they go abroad and sort of stuff, and they break down and think, what do we do now? People do not count the cost and they make foolish decisions. There was one famous occasion many years ago when I was on a long journey in a minibus. It was many years ago when I was working for the YMCA up in Norwich, and it was late at night and we were coming back from somewhere and we were running low on fuel in the minibus. I wasn't driving. Our driver said that he thought, and that's the key word here, he thought he had enough to get us back to Norwich and the YMCA there. We asked if he was sure. Well, we passed an open garage, bright light shining, all of that sort of stuff there. He said, no, we're okay. We don't need to put another tenner in. We don't need to fill her up. We don't need to do that. We said, okay. We passed another open garage, and this time as we went past, there was a smell of beef burgers on the air, and I thought, I could do with one of those. But he said, no, we're okay. We don't need to be in there. Everything's fine. And just bear in mind that this was 30 plus years ago, whenever it was, 35 years ago, before we had the 24-hour opening of shops and service stations. Going back in the day, especially over Sunday night, things used to close about 10 at night, 10, 11 o'clock at night, unless you're on like motorways, or you were very fortunate. Like us. One last garage, and I asked, are you really sure that we're going to get there okay? Because there was a sign which said Norwich, 90 miles. Oh, I know what I'm doing. I know this vehicle. I've driven this vehicle for years. I know it like the back of my hand. Blah, 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 blah. He went on like that. 30 minutes later, guess what happened? Anyone want a guess? We ran out of petrol in the middle of nowhere on the A47 between Kings Lynn and Dereham. It was a barren stretch of land. We sat there, this is about 11:15, not a single car came past, nothing. There was nothing that way, there was nothing that way, and the driver sat there and said, well, that was a surprise. And we said, yeah, what? A surprise? Oh, like that. And he said, and he said to us, well, we'll need a volunteer to go and walk back to that garage. And so I slung him out. I kind of opened the door, I pulled him out, and I said, you get back there, you walk back to those garages, and you get some petrol. This is your fault, not anybody else's. So off he went, and well, we spent the night in that minibus, 10 of us in a 16-seater sprawled out, and it was very cold, it was very cramped, And sometime after 7:15 in the morning, there was a car pulled up, and here was this fella there with a little can of petrol. And he said, "I got some." We said, "Oh, congratulations." But anyway, like that. Well, the driver wasn't very wise, was he? He didn't take notice of the needle. He didn't take notice of the red warning lights and all the rest of it. And but I do have to say that he had sore feet by the time he got back to us and so on. You know, so I did have a shred of sympathy for him. I have to say. Every year, you get thousands of tourists go to a city in Italy called Pisa, not pizza, but Pisa, to see the famous Leaning Tower of Pisa, of which is named after. And in 2017, Jane and I went to Florence in Italy. It's for her 50th birthday. I know she doesn't look ancient. Yeah. And I'm in trouble now, aren't I? And of course, we went to Florence, went around, saw some beautiful stuff, and we had a day trip on the train to go and see this Pisa, this tower. I have to say that I wasn't really impressed with it. It was just a big building, which instead of being straight, was like that. And of course, people have to take the picture where it's leaning over, and you stand there with your hand as though you're holding the tower up. It's famous because of the fact that it's leaning. That's the only reason people would go there. And you kind of think that the whole thing will topple over at any second when you see it. We didn't go up it, did we? I thought to myself, no way. There's lots of other beautiful stuff to see there. But the city of Pisa is spending millions of euros trying to put in new foundations. They've got these hydraulic ramps where they're trying to move it slowly up into position again. But all this trouble wouldn't have been necessary if the original builders had been more careful to build it on something more solid rather than where they did, but they didn't. That is a prime example of the foolish man building on sand. And it's not particularly fantastic, I didn't think. You know, we had a nice day there, didn't we? Yeah, that was fantastic. So, the challenge for all of us gathered here today, and it's always good to have a challenge in life, isn't it? Isn't it? Do you think so? Or would you like challenges? Anybody like a challenge? No? Yeah, no, 3 people do. Huh? Oh, she married me. Yeah, Becky's going, yeah, sometimes. It all depends what it is. Well, I like challenges, and since I started rowing, I've completed 2 major challenges. I've done over 300,000 metres, and I rowed from Dover to Calais the other day, virtually, on my indoor rower. So I like challenges. But here's the challenge for all of us. What is your life built on? Think about this. Is it the rock of Jesus and faith in God for not only this life, but for eternity? Because this is what we're dealing with. We're not just looking at the here and now, but faith in Jesus is about eternal life. Think about that. Do we follow the teachings of Jesus, the rock? Or are we unwise and just shrug and think, what will be, mañana, or whatever the word is? No thought for eternity, no thought for what's going to happen around us. You think about that. Now, we're not told what happens in this parable after the rains came in this parable. But I can only guess, maybe like in the little video, that the man helped out his brother who had fallen on hard times when his house collapsed and was destroyed by the storm. Let's remember, as we finish, that there are many whose entire lives, and even the nations that they're in, are built on sand. There are many countries around the world where if the wind changes directions, there will be a rebellion, there will be a famine, and their lives really are built on the sand, and they need help where possible. But there is people around us whose entire lives is built on the sand. Why? Because they don't yet know about the rock of Jesus. And that's why as a church, as Christians, we need to share all about Jesus and to help move those people from the sinking sand onto the solid rock. Well, how do we do that? Okay. Last week we looked at Matthew's Gospel chapter 2, didn't we? And there's one of the Pharisees came to Jesus and said, "Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Which is the best commandment? Which one do you advise us to follow so we can get the maximum out of our faith?" And then Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, This is the first and greatest commandment. In other words, he was saying, everything within you, stand on the rock that is God. Stand on that rock. And he goes on. And the second commandment is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. So what he's saying here is that if you stand on the rock, then you are going to be able to help your neighbour from a position of strength. And that's important to do, isn't it? If you think about it. So, there we go. That's just what I wanted to share this morning, just about that. And I hope it's been helpful. Just have a little read of Matthew 5, 6 and 7 in this coming week, because what you'll see there, you will see all the things that Jesus was talking about is there for us. That is the rock. That's the foundations. If you think that when people build foundations, they just don't build a great big hole. They dig stuff out and then they put everything into it, like rubble and metal and concrete, all that sort of stuff. That's how you build up the foundations through that. And all of those teachings of Jesus is the foundation. Amen. Well, we're going to have communion together now. And it's a really, really, really important time for us. And it's the first time I've done it for some while. Certainly since COVID has washed over us as a nation, and in fact the world. There's been so many things we weren't able to do. For some time we weren't able to sing, were we? We weren't able to sing at church. We had to have the masks on, so we could only hum behind your mask. We weren't allowed to have teas and coffees after service. We weren't allowed to shake hands and hug each other and all that sort of stuff. And out of all of those things, I found that not having communion was perhaps the one which kind of rattled me the most, because it's such a central part of the Christian faith through that. So just on your tables, you've got these little cups. And if you want to grab one of those, yeah, you can have one as well. And if you just, oh, that's right, yeah. So if you just take that first little piece off, if you can, that should come off quite easy. And inside you'll find this little wafer. It's unleavened bread apparently. So if you just take that and just put it, not yet, in a minute, like that. Oh, that's all right. And then just beneath that you'll see that there's another little seal here, okay? And there's a little lid, which if you can pull it back very carefully, you will have the grape juice just underneath. If there's anybody who can't do it, just give us a call and we'll come and give you. This is. Have you done it? That's it. And then when you're done, just put it on the table. Just put it down. How are we all doing?
I want to do it too hot.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Oh yeah, that's it. You've done it. That's okay. Yeah, leave it like that. Yeah.